There's a specific kind of quiet that falls over you when your world implodes, not with a bang but with a ping. It was just another Tuesday. I was loading the dishwasher after dinner when my husband texted me a screenshot, a list of Amazon orders for our kids' Christmas gifts. He meant to be helpful. Thought he was being a good dad. But there, at the bottom of the screenshot, was a shipping address I didn't recognize. It wasn't ours. It wasn't any family I knew. And it wasn't local. Something inside me clicked. That address nagged at me. So while he was in the shower, I pulled out my laptop and checked the recent browser history. I told myself it was just to ease my mind, but deep down I already knew. And there it was. That address. Again and again. Along with flight reservations, hotel bookings, Venmo payments labeled with little hearts, and lingerie orders delivered across the country. The delivery address belonged to a woman he'd mentioned once in passing, a co-worker. Married. She lived in a state far from ours. The same state he traveled to for work once a month. I didn't cry. Not then. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I was quiet, too quiet. Over the next few days, I became a different version of myself. One who smiles while printing receipts. Who hugs her children while forwarding emails to a private folder. I went through our joint credit card statements with the eye of a forensic accountant. Airline confirmations. Spa packages. Monogrammed bathrobes from Etsy. Couples cooking classes. Romantic getaways disguised as board meetings. He was planning a new trip in January to Las Vegas. But the one happening this week? That was a luxury resort in the desert. Couples massage included. He told me it was a leadership conference. I spent 4 weeks preparing. I wrote a 10-page letter. Page after page of everything I knew. I printed photos. Receipts. Screen grabs. And then I slid the envelope into the lining of his suitcase. Taped it inside like a farewell gift. The morning he left, I helped him zip his bag. He kissed me on the cheek. I told him to travel safe. My voice never cracked. What he didn't know is that when he landed, he'd receive a group message from me. One text sent to both him and his mistress, wishing them a lovely time, and letting them know exactly what was in his suitcase. I had written a separate section of that letter just for her. And she'd be getting her own copy. Emailed directly. He was in the air now. I waited. His flight landed an hour and a half ago. He told me he'd text when he landed, like he always did. But this time there was silence. So I texted him. Twice. Both messages were marked as delivered, but not read. I checked our phone records. Yes, I had started tracking that too. He'd texted both me and her during his layover. Probably feeding us both the same lies in different fonts. I refreshed his email, the one he never remembered to log out of. No Uber receipts from the final airport to the hotel. Nothing. That meant she'd picked him up. Of course she had. She lived in that state. They were probably smiling in the car right now, sipping overpriced coffee, unaware that their little fairy tale was about to crash face first into reality. My plan was simple. I'd wait until 4 p.m. local time for the hotel's check-in, then send the group text. The message that would make the floor drop out beneath them. But 2 hours before launch, things got weird. I sent him photos of our kids. Just a casual "they miss you already" red heart. No response. And suddenly, my messages were turning green. My stomach dropped. Green means undelivered. Green means you've been blocked. He had blocked me. I wasn't sure if I wanted to laugh or scream. Blocked. After 13 years, 2 kids, and a shared mortgage. After late nights comforting his anxiety. After being the one to pick up the pieces every time he floundered at work or fought with his family. Blocked. It was almost poetic. But I wouldn't let a green bubble stop me. Not now. My best friend had come over just in time to watch me spiral. When I told her, she handed me her phone. He didn't block me, she said. Yet. I used her number to send the message. A calm, razor-sharp group text. Hi. I know everything. Check your suitcase for a letter. There's also a copy in your inbox. I'll be contacting a divorce attorney this week. Enjoy your trip. We stared at the phone like it was a bomb. It delivered. Now we waited. Minutes passed. Silence. I called the hotel. I need to speak to Mr. Last name. He should have checked in around 4 o'clock. After a moment on hold, the receptionist transferred me. I held my breath. She answered. His mistress. Her voice was high, cautious. And I lost it. Everything I had buried, the rage, the humiliation, the months of betrayal, came up in a volcanic rush. I told her everything. How I knew. How long I'd known. How every second of their little fantasy had been documented. She said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Then he called me. His voice was ice. No apology. No explanation. No emotion. Just, I guess we should get a divorce. As if we were deciding on dinner. He fought me on nothing. He was flat. Hollow. Empty. I expected pain. I expected panic. What I didn't expect was indifference. That was the part that hurt the most. When the phone call ended, it didn't feel real. He had just told me, flatly, almost casually, that a divorce was in order. No tears. No regret. Not even a flicker of guilt. Just cold acknowledgement and silence. I sat in the living room for what felt like hours. The lights were off, the TV still playing some forgettable sitcom in the background. I was surrounded by the ghosts of our life, the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the shoes he left by the stairs, the half-finished cup of coffee still sitting in the sink. And then something inside me snapped. I stood up and began ripping every photo off the walls. Our honeymoon in Maui? Gone. The family portrait from last fall? Smashed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I moved like a machine, tearing down each reminder of the life I thought we had. The rage kept me warm. I started collecting his things. Shirts. Shoes. Razors. Chargers. Cologne. Every pair of socks, every book he left on the nightstand, every scrap of his presents, packed into boxes with surgical precision. By the time my best friend arrived, I had 6 boxes and a trash bag lined up at the door. I brought wine, she said softly. I brought justice, I replied, tossing another pair of his sneakers into the pile. Together, we moved it all into the garage. His collectibles were carefully stacked. His clothes folded just enough to keep them from wrinkling. Not because I cared, but because I wanted it all to look like a transaction. Cold. Clean. Efficient. He would come home to find his life in cardboard and the locks changed. Later that night, when the adrenaline faded, the silence roared. I sat alone on the floor of my bedroom, knees pulled to my chest, surrounded by holes in the walls where our pictures used to hang. My sons were sleeping soundly in their rooms, blissfully unaware. I stared at the empty space above my dresser where our wedding portrait had lived for 10 years. I felt like a failure. I called my mom. It took everything in me not to break down. I told her the truth. That it was over. That he cheated. That I'd found everything, emails, receipts, pictures. That I had known for weeks and waited for the perfect moment to expose it. She didn't say, "I told you so." She said, "Come home whenever you need. You and the boys." And that nearly undid me. Even in betrayal, I wasn't alone. I had a family. I had friends. I had proof, strength, and a garage full of closure. All he had was a suitcase and a mistress in monogrammed robes. Sunday night arrived like a storm cloud. His flight was due in at 9:45 p.m. I knew the time not because he told me, but because I checked his confirmation email before he left. He hadn't texted. Not to check in. Not to ask about the kids. Not to say he was coming home. But home no longer existed. Not for him. The house was clean. Cold. Silent. And every last item that belonged to him was now in the garage, neat rows of boxes waiting like a final goodbye. His toothbrush? Boxed. His watch collection? Wrapped and labeled. His precious vinyl records? Alphabetized by an old version of me who still believed in our marriage. The locks had not been changed. Yet. He legally had access for now. But I had already removed his key. He could knock all he wanted. The door would not open for him again. I wasn't interested in confrontation. I was interested in closure. Earlier that day, I had emailed his mistress a copy of the letter. 10 pages. Every receipt. Every reservation. Every photo. Her name in bold at the top of the final page. I ended it with a question. Did you know you were helping destroy a family, or were you just too excited to ask? No reply. I didn't expect one. At 10:07 p.m., headlights hit the front of the house. He was back. He didn't knock. He used the garage code, the one I forgot to disable. That was on me. I heard the beep. I heard the door creak open. I stayed upstairs. Lights off. Curtain cracked just enough to see. He stood in the garage for a long time just looking at the boxes. His body slumped like someone who finally realized the performance was over and the crowd wasn't clapping. He didn't try to come in. He just left. Quietly. Car doors shut. Engine turned over. Tail lights fading down the street. That was the moment I knew he had no fight left in him. No argument. No defense. And honestly, that was more insulting than if he had screamed. If he had begged. If he had cried. Indifference, the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. The next morning he texted, "I'll come by later to get my car." I replied with one word, "Fine." No more pleading. No more trying to understand. No more cleaning up his messes. This time I wasn't going to let him twist the story. This time I was writing the ending. Over the next few days a strange calm settled in. We spoke barely. Only about the children. Only about logistics. His voice was flat. Mine was colder. He stayed in the basement like a guest overstaying his welcome. I didn't see him often, but when I did, we played pretend for the kids. No arguing. No scenes. Just civility. It was surreal, watching him sit across the dinner table from our boys, asking about school like he hadn't just spent a week in a resort with another woman. He didn't mention the letter. Neither did I. Instead, we made appointments for mediation. I contacted a lawyer. So did he. No arguments. No objections. Just silence between the signatures. We were strangers in the same house. But what truly broke me was Christmas. He watched them open their gifts. He smiled, took a few photos, then quietly excused himself back to the basement. Like he couldn't bear to be in the light too long. Like guilt had given him a sunburn. A few days later, we had our first mediation session over Zoom. He didn't contest anything. Not the house. Not the custody. Not the finances. He just wanted it over. His face stayed neutral the entire call. But when the mediator asked about his future living situation, and I mentioned the state where his mistress lived, he froze. He didn't correct me. Didn't deny it. He just sat there quiet. So I said it for him. He's planning to move to be with the woman he had an affair with. It was the first time anyone had said it out loud in a formal setting. And he didn't flinch. Because by now the lie had rotted too far to fix. He began making calls to her in the middle of the day. I could hear his voice echoing from the basement, low, soft, giggling. The sound of someone who believed he'd escaped consequence. He hadn't. I was still holding the rope. He made promises during mediation. That he wouldn't visit her until he had an apartment. That he'd stay focused on the children. That he would help with the transition. He lied. 2 days later, he booked a flight, Valentine's Day weekend. He left the house casually, tossing a bag over his shoulder, saying to the boys, "I'm going." I was the one who had to explain where he went. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask for details. I simply said, "Send your flight info." He didn't. He didn't plan to return on time either, even though he'd promised to be back for my birthday. He said the flights were too expensive. That he couldn't change it now. That it was out of his hands. But I had the internet too. And I saw the ticket prices. He just didn't want to be here. He didn't want to see the children. Or me. Or the wreckage he left behind. Fine. But I would never forget. Because while he played house with someone new, I was the one comforting our children through their first fatherless holiday. And I was the one buying bunk beds he had promised to help with. And I was the one folding back the pieces of my life alone. We barely spoke. When we did, it was about logistics, the kids, the schedule, the mediation. But I overheard him on the phone one night. I was in the kitchen and the basement door was ajar. He didn't know I could hear. He told her I had been crazy. That I exploded on him. That I screamed and cried and raged. That he had to laugh in my face just to stay sane. None of it was true. There was no explosion. No yelling. No breakdown. I had given him facts. Evidence. Calmly. Brutally. And now he was rewriting the story for her. Because villains need heroes, and he had cast himself as the victim. He even told her I bragged about dating again. I hadn't even opened the apps. It wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. Because she would only know me by his fiction. And one day she might become part of my children's lives. That terrified me. Because if she saw me as unstable, as hateful as everything he claimed, how would she treat my sons? I wasn't jealous. I was protective. And no matter how much I wanted to scream, I stayed silent. But I knew one thing: if she ever met me, the truth would burn away every lie he ever told. He'd been sulking again. Walking through the house like a ghost, no eye contact, no warmth, no apology. Just silence. Like he expected me to ask what was wrong. Like he wanted me to offer comfort. Not my job anymore. One night after the kids had gone to bed, he sat at the dining table alone. I passed by without acknowledging him. He didn't move. It felt deliberate, like he wanted attention. When I gave him none, he finally said it. "I told my dad everything." I paused. Slowly turned. "Everything?" He nodded. Then tears. Full, ugly sobs. He said it was the first time in his life his father acted like a father. The irony almost choked me. This was the same man who abandoned him as a child. The same man he swore he'd never be like. And now? He was doing the exact same thing to his own kids, disappearing into someone else's life, walking away from the mess he helped create. I didn't console him. I wasn't about to comfort the man who broke our family, then cried because someone finally saw through him. A few days later, our youngest had a birthday. I asked if he wanted his father to stop by for cake. He texted his dad multiple times. No reply. Later that night, he learned his father had left the state with his new girlfriend. Just weeks after asking for a divorce from his wife of 30 years. That's when it hit me. Adultery might run in this family like blood. And maybe, just maybe, my sons deserved a chance to break that cycle. It finally happened. A moving truck pulled up to the house, and for once it wasn't delivering lies. It was taking them away. He loaded his things quietly. I stayed inside with the kids, distracting them with snacks and schoolwork. But our youngest refused to leave the window. He watched the boxes disappear with wide eyes. When the truck pulled away, he asked, "Is the truck coming back?" It broke me. Not because he missed his father, but because he thought he was next. I scooped him up and held him for what felt like forever, whispering that we were staying, that he was safe, that he would always have a home. Later that day, his friends started messaging me. Some were supportive. Most just wanted the tea. So I gave it to them. I didn't lie. I didn't embellish. I just told the truth. He cheated, that he traveled during a pandemic. He abandoned his family. And now he was moving across the country to help raise someone else's kids. Their wives were furious. They thought he was a man of integrity, a good example for their husbands. They were wrong. Meanwhile, his mother, my now ex-Mil, still didn't know her husband was cheating. I didn't have concrete proof, just a strong gut feeling and a trail of red flags. I didn't want to be the one to shatter her world. But I also knew what it felt like to live in a lie. After weeks of avoidance, he was finally gone. The basement echoed. The silence was mine. I started to breathe again. We'd finalized nearly everything in mediation. The divorce papers were ready. Just signatures and stamps left. He was still dragging his feet on moving into his new apartment, probably milking the low bills in my house while he could. But the end was in sight. I asked one last thing. "Before she meets our kids, I want to meet her." He went still. He couldn't understand why that mattered. He said I'd be rude. That I'd cause drama. That I just wanted to stir things up. But I had no anger left. No games. No jealousy. I just needed to look her in the eye. I told him, "You got your prize. I'm not here to take it back. I just want to know who's around my children." He couldn't argue. I had every right. But the truth is, I think he was scared. Because once she met me, she'd see the woman behind the story he'd spun. She'd see that I wasn't unstable. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't a villain. I was strong. Calm. Sharp. Done. And maybe, just maybe, she'd start to wonder what else he lied about. He's gone now. Fully. Finally. I'm raising our boys on my own. They laugh again. They sleep better. So do I. He calls sometimes. Sends gifts. Tries to pretend he's still involved. But the damage is done. And while he plays family with someone new, I'm rebuilding mine. To those who said I was crazy, dramatic, bitter, I say this. There's no blood in this water. So if you came to watch me drown, you'll be sorely disappointed. I didn't drown. I swam. And I made it to shore.